Before we get into the video, I want to briefly mention something. It's getting increasingly difficult to support this channel via YouTube ads, so I've created a Patreon. It will act as a place I can put supplementary material for those who are interested, but also it's a way you can help keep this channel alive. If you appreciate the work I do, and you are financially able and willing to render support, I would greatly appreciate it. There's a few different tiers from $3 a month to $20, where you will also get a producer credit on the channel. If you're interested, I'll put a link to the Patreon page in the description of this video. Right now, for signing up, you can get early access to part 2 of this video. In the end, patron or not, I'm eternally grateful for all the support I've received from subscribers in the last couple years. Thank you so much. I've decided the best way to cover this case is to split it into 2 parts rather than have one extensively long video. A video on the Yuba 5 has been frequently requested, and I was surprised at the wealth of information that exists on this case. I think people already familiar with this incident will learn many new details. Because of that, keep an eye out for part 2. For the unfamiliar, this story takes place in February of 1978, and involves the disappearance of 5 men. The events take place across multiple areas in California, Yuba City, Chico, and the mountains north of Oroville. In order to best understand this case, it is important to know the individuals involved. Each of the 5 men had some sort of mental handicap or mental illness, though at differing levels of severity. All of the men had met and become friends through Gateway Projects, an organization dedicated to mentally disabled individuals. All of the men lived in the Yuba City area between Marysville, Linda, and Olivehurst. Together they enjoyed attending sporting events, playing basketball, or going bowling. Jack Hewitt was 24 years old. He was very shy and reclusive. He hardly ever spoke, and when he did, it was with a notable speech impediment. He also could not read or write. He did not particularly like to be away from home and had never stayed somewhere else overnight. He was nonviolent and considered to be a follower. He had also worked at Gateway Projects for the last 4 or 5 years. Jack's father indicated that of the 5 men, Jack was the most handicapped. Jack's best friend was Ted Weiher, whom he had known for around 8 years. The two were said to be almost constant companions. Jack did not like telephones and could not concentrate long enough to really be able to use one. Ted Weiher was 32 years old. He was slow in learning things, but outgoing, friendly, and he loved to talk to people. He was considered mostly non-violent, but with a quick temper. He could read, write, and do simple math. Ted could hold down a simple job, but required a lot of supervision. Ted was afraid of the dark and was unlikely to venture out alone at night without somebody going with him. Ted generally took care of Jack when they were together and made many of the decisions for the two. He could get confused easily and had a poor sense of direction. Some behavioral examples for him include that he did not understand why someone would need to stop at a stop sign, and once didn't want to leave a burning house because he was busy sleeping and had to be forcibly removed from his bed. His mother believed that if he were ever caught in a dangerous situation, he would simply run and hide. Ted could easily be influenced by anyone who was friendly to him. He was not considered a follower or a leader, but when confronted with a problem, could analyze and make a decision accordingly. Jack Madruga was 30 years old. He was considered to be a shy loner, and his parents stated that he was not mentally handicapped, but he was slow in his thought processes. He was known to be nonviolent and had the ability to hold down a job as a dishwasher and support himself. Madruga was in the Army for about 2 years, during which time he was a truck driver. He was eventually honorably discharged in 1968. Madruga lived with his mother, but he also helped pay rent at their home and took care of his own finances. His mother said that he was not a leader and did not have a strong personality. He could, however, assess a situation and make an appropriate judgment. Madruga's best friend was Bill Sterling, who was his constant companion. Madruga was the only one of the group to have a car, and he would never let anyone else drive it. He was also afraid of the dark. Bill Fxllxng was 29 years old. He had been hyperactive his entire life and could be a danger to himself and others if they got in his way. Bill was very social and got along well with others. His best friend was Jack Madruga. He was considered basically non-violent, but would defend himself if necessary. Fxllxng was able to graduate high school and was also able to hold down a job when one was available. His parents felt that he could be taken advantage of rather easily. He could also be considered either a leader or a follower. Bill's mother said that he and Madruga were good walkers and that they could cover significant distance in a short time. Bill's basketball coach said that he was somewhat more intelligent than the others, but also very lazy. Gary Mathias was 25 years old. He spent time in the U.S. Army between 1972 and 1973. He was medically discharged after he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. During his time in the Army, he was also suspected of drug use. After the Army, Gary tried to go to school but was unable to keep up and soon failed. Instead of facing his stepfather, Gary ran away to Oregon where his grandmother lived. Sometime later, Gary would show up back at his parents' house in rough shape. He had walked and hitchhiked from his grandmother's house in Portland, Oregon, to his parents' home outside Yuba City, California, a distance of roughly 535 miles. During that time, he had stolen milk from porches and eaten dog food to stay alive on the way. After returning home, he made friends with Madruga, Fxllxng, Hewitt, and Wire. Around the time of the disappearance, he had expressed being very content living at home. He was protective of Hewitt and Wire and would not likely follow Madruga and Fxllxng into doing something that he was not okay with. He could drive a car and was not afraid of anything. He was readily able to defend himself if threatened. He was also considered a bit of an odd man out in the group, with one parent calling him a fifth wheel. Gary's basketball coach said he was spacey and seemed like he could flip at any time. Of all the missing men, it was said that Gary would be the one most likely to lead or suggest places to go or things to do. Gary was also considered to be rather unpredictable and sometimes violent, especially if he was having a schizophrenic episode. Because of this, Gary had a serious and extensive criminal history. For the 2 years prior to his disappearance, Gary had been taking medication that helped calm him, and he was considered a model patient by his doctors. During this time, Gary did not have any notable run-ins with the law, and things seemed to be going well for him. Though this is a fairly broad description of each of these men's personalities, you can get a reasonable grasp on what the group dynamic might have looked like. The group were always close and known to many as simply the boys. Their behavior was typically easy to predict, and rarely did they divert from their usual or scheduled activities. It seems generally agreed upon that all the men were relatively high-functioning, but when placed into a stressful situation, their behavior could deteriorate quickly. The following description of events is based on police interviews that would later be conducted with key witnesses. Combining all these interviews, I have pieced together a narrative and timeline that will cover events before, during, and after the incident. On the evening of February 24, 1978, the 5 men were planning on seeing a basketball game at Chico State University in the city of Chico, some 46 miles north of Yuba City. Madruga, as the driver, was to pick up each of his friends in his 1969 blue and white Mercury Montego, and was last seen by Bill Fxllxng's mother around 6 p.m. while getting fuel from a gas station. Afterwards, the duo picked up Wire and Mathias before finally getting Hewitt around 6:30 to 6:45 p.m. The 5 men then left Yuba City and proceeded to make the hour-long drive along Highway 99 to the city of Chico, a trip the men had made together many times before. All the men were expected to return home by the late evening, for in the morning, they were planning to travel to Sierra College to participate in a basketball tournament connected to the Special Olympics. They were all very excited about it. The five men arrived at Chico State University and were seen attending the basketball game that began at 8 p.m. Witnesses did not notice anything strange regarding their behavior during this time, with one witness saying the boys were quietly enjoying themselves, and that the boys were still there when the game ended at 9:50 p.m. After the game, around 10 p.m., the group stopped by Bears Market on 8th and Pine. The store clerk at the time, Mary Davis, would later tell police about how the five men came in around closing time, which she found annoying as she was trying to leave. According to Mary, they ended up buying an abnormal amount of junk food before leaving. She would state that the men seemed happy, excited, and unworried. Once the group got back to their vehicle, they would have presumably begun their drive back home on Highway 99. But the boys never made it back to Yuba City. Earlier in the evening, around 5 p.m., a man named Joseph Shones was sitting at his vacation home in Berry Creek, some 25 miles east of Chico. Mr. Shones became bored and decided to leave his trailer home off of Rockefeller Avenue and drive north to the Brush Creek Bar, where he had at least one beer. He then went to the Mountain House Bar, where he had some more beers. Sometime between 5:30 and 6 p.m., Mr. Shones left the Mountain House and began heading north up the Oroville-Quincy Highway. Shones's plan was to check the snow line because his family was going to visit over the weekend, and he anticipated that they would want to go and play in the snow. He also stated that he simply wanted to kill a little bit of time. Witnesses at the Mountain House confirmed seeing Shones leave, thinking it was very strange for him to head up that way, as he knew that many cars would get stuck in the snow on the rough road up there. Sometime between 6 and 6:30 p.m. and about 8 miles up the highway, Mr. Shones found the snow he was looking for, but his Volkswagen Beetle also became stuck in it. Specifically, Mr. Shones was heading up a hill until about 4,400 feet in elevation when he says his vehicle lost traction and bottomed out. Mr. Shones tried for roughly half an hour to get his vehicle unstuck, but was only successful in moving it about 12 feet when he began to experience severe pains in his chest, which he was certain was a heart attack. He subsequently became very ill, perspiring freely while also vomiting all around his Volkswagen. Mr. Shones got back into his vehicle, turned the engine on and the lights, and tried to get warm and dry out. During this time, he was in and out of his vehicle, vomiting and defecating multiple times. Hours later, at around 11 p.m. to midnight, Mr. Shones was aroused from sleep by a whistling noise that he described as being like a person calling a dog. Shortly afterward, he felt that someone was shining lights into his vehicle. The windows on the Volkswagen were completely fogged over at the time, and Mr. Shones was unable to make out the figures that were outside. He rolled down one of the front windows and yelled to the people outside that he was sick and needed help. The figures immediately proceeded back down the road to the south. As they left, Mr. Shones continued to honk the car horn and to yell after them that he needed help. Getting no response, as the figures continued moving down the road, Mr. Shones struggled out of his vehicle and began working his way up a snowbank on the roadside. From his new vantage point, Mr. Shones was able to look down the road and see two vehicles. One of the vehicles he thought might have been a light-colored Ford sedan, while the other one was a rust-colored pickup truck parked directly behind it at an angle. The headlights of the vehicles were shining in such a way that he was unable to make out much of what was happening, but he could discern that there were figures walking around. Mr. Shones got the impression that one of the figures near the driver's door of the pickup was a woman holding a baby. Mr. Shones tried to yell to the figures from atop the hill that he needed help, but he received no response. Instead, the pickup truck's engine then started, and all the figures got into the truck, which then left the area. Mr. Shones returned to his Volkswagen to try and get warm. The engine was still idling and his lights were still on until around midnight, when the vehicle ran out of gas. At around 2 a.m. the next morning, Mr. Shones began to get cold and he realized that he would have to try and walk back to the Mountain House bar. He spent the next 2 hours trying to psych himself up and prepare for the grueling 7-mile walk through the snow. It was 4 in the morning when Mr. Shones began to make his walk down the hill. He had only been walking for a few seconds when he came across the vehicle he thought was a Ford sedan. In actuality, it was a blue and white Mercury Montego. Mr. Shones opened the driver's door and looked inside. The dome light came on, illuminating the interior of the vehicle, with items strewn all around. Later on, Mr. Shones would say that something about the way the interior looked made him think of a child. Mr. Shones then continued his difficult walk toward the mountain house, sometimes only moving 30 or 40 feet at a time before needing to rest. He finally reached his destination around 10 a.m. Employees and patrons witnessed Mr. Shones stumble into the mountain house and sit down in a seat at the bar. The waitress on duty, Irene Aycock, would later tell authorities that Mr. Shones placed his hand on his head and stated, "I should have done this 2 years ago." Other witnesses at the mountain house corroborated that Shones made this statement. Mr. Shones then asked for 2 aspirins and a glass of water, which he was given. After taking the aspirin, he asked if anyone could give him a ride home. Mrs. Aycock asked a local, Steve Robinson, if he would be willing to drive Shones home, and he agreed. Mr. Robinson and his girlfriend, Laura Lynn Smith, then began driving Mr. Shones back to his house. During this time, Shones must have been feeling somewhat better, as he had spent quite some time criticizing the driving of Mr. Robinson. When Mr. Robinson was later asked by detectives if he could recall anything from the drive, he stated that Shones described that he had become stuck in the snow above the mountain house, and that a car had followed him so closely that he could not stop and he could not turn around. Shones said that he could not get off of the road, and when he tried to go up a hill, he became stuck. Mr. Robinson stated that Shones blamed the entire incident of getting stuck, as well as the physical stress that he was suffering, on another vehicle that had been following him. A story that is notably different from the one that he would later convey to investigators. While in the vehicle, Mr. Shones made no mention of having had a heart attack, though he looked very tired. When the trio arrived at Shones' trailer home, Mr. Shones exited the vehicle without a word of thanks, went inside, and immediately went to bed. Meanwhile, in Yuba City, the parents of the 5 men were in a state of panic. Many of them had been up all night waiting for their respective children to come home, unsure of what to do. The parents began calling each other, confirming that none of the men had made it home the night prior. This type of thing had simply never happened before. Back near the mountain house, a man named Bill Neal, who worked with the Forest Service, was driving up the Oroville-Quincy Highway in order to go cross-country skiing. He estimated that the time was approximately 10 a.m. when he arrived at the snow line and found a Mercury Montego parked in the middle of the road. Mr. Neal noted that the Montego did not appear to be stuck, and was sitting on snow that was about 5 or 6 inches deep. He noticed some skid marks near the rear tires that indicated the wheels had been spinning. Either way, he thought the vehicle could easily be moved if someone wanted to. Mr. Neal also noted that the driver's side rear window was rolled down. He used a shovel to dig away the snow around the side of the vehicle so that he could drive past and get further up the hill. Afterwards, he went up a short distance, maybe 40 to 50 feet around a bend, and discovered Mr. Shones' Volkswagen stuck in the snow. Mr. Neal parked right next to the Volkswagen and noticed that its trunk lid was open, and it appeared as though someone had been working on the engine. He noticed a pile of feces on the ground that he thought was from a dog. Mr. Neal then began skiing and left the area. Back in Berry Creek, it was around noon when Mr. Shones' wife, Rosenda Shones, and their mentally handicapped daughter arrived from Sacramento. She found Mr. Shones in bed and woke him up, after which he tried to explain what had happened. Mrs. Shones subsequently decided to go up and attempt to get her Volkswagen out of the snow with the help of her daughter. She drove up to the mountain house and talked to the owner about what she was planning to do. The owner asked a man named Jim Birch to go with Mrs. Shones in order to help her get the vehicle unstuck. The trio went up the hill and came upon the location of the Volkswagen. They discovered that it was completely out of gas and the battery was dead. They found Bill Neal's pickup truck parked nearby and borrowed a shovel out of the back in order to help dig out the Volkswagen. They only succeeded in moving the Volkswagen south along the highway to a point where it was parked some 20 to 30 feet in front of the Montego. When Mrs. Shones described the area around the car, she said that there was vomit on the ground and some feces and that Joe had made quite a mess. Since their efforts to start the vehicle had failed, they decided to leave the area and come back Sunday, February 26th. Later around 2 p.m., Bill Neal came back from his skiing and noticed that the Volkswagen had been moved closer to the Montego. He thought that the Montego might have moved as well, but he wasn't sure. He noticed the window on the vehicle was still rolled down. Bill Neal then left the area. At around 6 p.m., Joseph Shones was taken to the Oroville Medical Center where he was admitted and treated for a mild heart attack. Back in Yuba City, Jack Madruga's mother called the authorities around 8 p.m., informing them that the 5 men had not returned home the night before. The group had, at this point, missed their Special Olympics basketball game at Sierra College. The Yuba County Sheriff began making attempts to discover where the 5 men could have gone. Mrs. Shones returned to the area of the Volkswagen between 10 a.m. and noon that Sunday, as planned. She asked one of her neighbors on Rockefeller Road, Bud Coveyou, to assist her with this task. This time, they took both gas and jumper cables and were able to get the vehicle started and drive it back home. While they were there, they noticed some 4 or 5 vehicles in the area and 10 or 12 people. They were all playing in the snow. On Tuesday, February 28th, Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego was officially discovered by authorities up on the deserted Oroville-Quincy Highway. A forest ranger had seen the car on February 25th, but thought nothing of it at the time since people go cross-country skiing in the area. Once he heard the news of the 5 missing men and the description of the car they were driving, he notified authorities of its location north of the mountain house. I was fortunate enough to get some old photo film strips that show what the car looked like when it was found. Keep in mind that the environment surrounding the vehicle has been changed. Bill Neal and possibly others had shoveled snow to clear a way past the vehicle by this time. Inside the vehicle, they found a number of candy wrappers, a discarded milk carton, and 4 different road maps. Authorities also found programs for the basketball game the boys attended. One of them had even written the scoring throughout the game. The vehicle still had a quarter tank of gas and started right up when police tried hot wiring it. The situation was a bit baffling to authorities as the car was not really stuck, and even if the boys were having problems, the 5 of them could have easily moved the vehicle. The photographs of the vehicle bear these facts out, as the back wheels are far from being buried in the snow. A search began in the immediate vicinity of the car's location, but a storm rolled in the very same day, dropping fresh snow in the area and creating dangerous conditions for searchers. One searcher would wind up having a heart attack, while another would catch pneumonia. Regardless, authorities from neighboring Butte and Plumas counties assisted in the search, using everything they could muster: search dogs, horses, 4-wheel drive vehicles, and even helicopters. The rough, craggy, and heavily wooded area proved difficult to search, and despite everything they put into it, they had no success in finding anything. On March 2nd, detectives made contact with Mr. Shones via telephone while he was still in the hospital. During this interview, Mr. Shones gave a general overview of what occurred on February 24th. And also made several statements that add details to his story and alter others. He stated that he got the impression that the group of individuals he saw could have been anywhere from 2 to 12 people. He also acknowledged that he had told his wife about another vehicle, a pickup truck, at the scene, but now stated that he did not recall seeing a pickup truck and may have been hallucinating due to his heart attack. As the search dragged on without success, Detectives began investigating the incident for signs of foul play. Tips and sightings of the 5 men started pouring in from all over. By far, the vast majority of these sightings proved to be misidentifications. At least one, however, seemed legitimate and caught the attention of authorities at the time. On March 3, 1978, a woman named Rosella Florence Mulder would tell police that on February 26th, at around 2:30 p.m., she stopped by Mary's Country Store in Brownsville. She ended up parking next to a red Chevrolet pickup truck. Inside the cab were 2 white males who both grinned at her. She felt that they may have been mentally challenged. 2 more white males were at a phone booth about 20 feet away. At first she thought one of the men was a woman. One was talking on the telephone while the other was looking around nervously. Inside the store, she noticed another man walking the aisles. Shortly afterward, she left. And once she heard about the disappearances of the Yuba Five, she contacted police about her sighting. Miss Mulder was shown a lineup to see if she could identify any of the missing men. She picked out Sterling, Wire, Madruga, and Hewitt as being the 4 men she had seen outside the store. Sterling and Wire were sitting in the car, with Hewitt on the payphone while Madruga was standing beside it. She had already seen pictures of the 5 men twice on television prior to this time. To follow up on this sighting, police interviewed the individual who had been working in Mary's Country Store at the time of the sighting, a Mr. Carroll Waltz. He was shown a photographic lineup by police to see if he could identify any of the 5 men. He identified Wire and possibly Hewitt as being in the group of 5 or 6 men who were in the store on both February 25th and February 26th, and who had driven there in an old red pickup. He stated that he had not seen the group since that time. Detectives were unable to do much with this information, but it was unique amongst the multitude of tips to get a couple witnesses who say they saw the Yuba boys at Mary's Country Store over the course of several different days, while also seeing the red truck. Detectives interviewed Mr. Shones in person on March 7, 1978, roughly 2 weeks after the incident and the same day he was set to leave the hospital. This was the most long-form and detailed interview Mr. Shones would provide to investigators. During this interview, Mr. Shones changed his opinion on the pickup truck. This time he told investigators that he did see the pickup truck behind the Montego, and also gave details about how it looked and how it was parked, no longer mentioning anything about the possibility of it having been a hallucination. Detectives noted during this interview that after the questioning became somewhat redundant, or when specific minute details were pursued, Shones began to have an attitude change. Up until that point, he had been very active and engaged in questioning. When he was asked to specifically describe the activity of the figures he had seen moving around the vehicles when he was on the snowbank, Shones became very defensive. He reclined back on his bed, put his hands behind his head, and said, "I get a feeling you guys think I know something about these dudes." Detectives note this behavior was out of character compared with the rest of the interview. Shones also described that during his first few days at the hospital, he was extremely emotional and could not talk to anyone without crying. He was unable to speak to even his wife without crying this way. During the interview, Mr. Shones also mentioned how brightly lit the area was by moonlight that night, and that he could not believe how bright it was. After the Shones interview, detectives would go on to talk to multiple witnesses from the mountain house and surrounding area. Their interviews provided the details for much of the narrative surrounding Shones after his arrival back at the mountain house that we covered earlier in this video. During the investigation, a number of people contacted police as character witnesses for some of the missing 5. A good few were in regard to behavior exhibited by Gary Mathias in the past. One witness, Janet Enzera, reported that Gary had told her on several occasions that he had a dream where he and several other people would disappear. He would also talk about spaceships and people from outer space. She would also say that she knew Gary to be a very violent person, hurting several men seriously, and that he also did not like women. Another witness, a Mr. Delosier, told police that he had once been involved in a fist fight with Gary Mathias, stating that Mathias had once hit him in the face for no apparent reason, and Mr. Delosier had retaliated. Mr. Delosier could also describe at least one other instance he knew of where Mathias had been involved in a fight. One of Gary Mathias's friends, Joseph Leal, also talked to police, telling them that Mathias's mood was sometimes up and down and that he could be very unpredictable. He described Gary as having a low tolerance for women. Mr. Leal could think of no reason why Gary or any of the other men would leave home or stay away. It should be noted, in relation to these actions attributed to Gary Mathias, that no dates were given for any specific incident, or whether or not they occurred before or after he had become medicated and more behaviorally stable in the prior 2 years. Another interesting report came from a man named Charles Hedrick. He contacted police to inform them about an incident that occurred 2 or 3 years prior to the disappearance. Mr. Hedrick was in the vicinity of Bucks Lake, where he was deer hunting prior to having an unusual encounter with Ted Wire. While hunting, Mr. Hedrick would stay at a cabin located not far from where Jack Madruga's car would eventually be found. When Mr. Hedrick arrived at the cabin, he found Wire and another man with a small boy. He said Wire didn't do much talking, but the trio were apparently hunting deer in the area. Mr. Hedrick informed them that they had no business being at the cabin, and since nothing in the cabin appeared to be missing, he simply told the group to leave. As they left, he noticed they were driving an older model Ford pickup that was faded red in color. Mr. Hedrick told police that he was positive that it was Ted Wire that he saw, since he actually lived very close to Wire's house in the city. When police contacted Mrs. Wire regarding this new information, she seemed completely unaware, stating that she had never known Ted to have a gun or to go deer hunting. She did know Ted to be associated with a man who owned a faded red Ford pickup, though. This individual was older and had children. Police tried to follow up on who this individual was, but seemed to have made little headway. By June 4th, 1978, the snow that had covered the search area in the winter had receded, and some motorcyclists were riding through the backcountry roads of the Granite Basin. They came across a Forestry Service fire camp located about a mile from the Daniels Inc. campground when their attention was directed to a trailer with a broken window. As they approached, they were overwhelmed by a nauseating odor. They attempted to look through the window of the trailer, and although it was dark, they could make out what appeared to be a dead body laying on a bed and covered in sheets. The group contacted the Plumas County Sheriff as the camp was in their jurisdiction, and Plumas County made contact with Yuba County shortly thereafter. The location of the forestry camp was about 5 miles as the crow flies from where Jack Madruga's car had been found. Deputies from Butte, Plumas, and Yuba County arrived on scene at the Granite Basin Fire Camp and found several buildings on the property. The main area of interest was a 60-foot trailer with its north side window broken from the outside. Below the broken window, deputies found several empty cans of army rations. Around the back door of the trailer, they found several paperback books lying on the ground. About 30 feet to the northeast of the trailer, they found a white bedsheet and one sock. When deputies entered the trailer, they found the remains of a white adult male in a bunk bed. Located on the bedside table were a number of items, like a wallet containing the ID of Ted Wire, a ring with the name Ted engraved on it, a neck chain, and a gold Waltham brand wristwatch which, according to the families, did not belong to any of the men. The body itself was completely covered by 8 sheets. Upon removing all the sheets from the body, the deputies recognized the clothing worn by the subject as the same as those worn by Ted Wire on the night of his disappearance. Wire was lying on his back with his hands on his chest. Both pant legs were rolled up above the knees, his shoes were missing, and his feet appeared to be badly frostbitten, with 3 toes completely missing from the right foot and 2 from the left. There was also evidence of severe infection coming from the feet. The face was unidentifiable at the time, but particular note was taken of the fact that the subject had a full beard and mustache. Ted Wire had been clean-shaven at the time of his disappearance. It was clear that Wire had been starving and had lost vast amounts of weight while staying in the trailer. Deputies noticed that surrounding the body were several more cans of army rations that had been opened in the same manner as the ones found outside, using a P-38 can opener which comes with each case of C rations. There was also heavy Forestry Service clothing, playing cards, and notebooks laying around on the floor. There was evidence that a candle had been lit, however there was no evidence that any attempt had been made to light any kind of fire. Also located in the trailer was a pair of low-quarter black canvas tennis shoes. The shoes were not Wire's, who was wearing suede leather shoes when he disappeared. The black tennis shoes did match the description of those worn by Gary Mathias, whose parents would later confirm them to be his. Later, all of the buildings nearby were examined, and it was determined that a trailer directly parallel to the one with Wire's remains had been ransacked. However, Forestry Service personnel were unable to say if anything was missing or if anything had been moved from one trailer to the other. Another structure on the property had also been broken into. The Forestry Service personnel determined that several blankets and 3 cases of C rations were missing and were consistent with the 31 empty cans found in and around the trailer housing Wire's body. I will point out that there is variation in the reported amount of cans found. The sheriff's report leads me to believe 31, but some newspapers state 36, and at least one newspaper states that 72 cans were found, of which most had been opened but not all. Acknowledging the possible uncertainty here, I'm going to go with 31 cans indicated in the report. It was also discovered that several cases of dehydrated food in this structure had been overlooked, perhaps because the men had failed to search the locker the food was being stored in. One other structure on the property had been entered by someone using a pry bar to break the padlock, but there was no evidence that any of its contents had been removed. This was unusual because the structure held gasoline, oil heaters, and oil. Outside there was also a large butane tank that provided the trailer with heat and light when turned on, though at the time it was likely obscured by snow. Still, the resources were there to keep the men good and warm for quite some time. Later, searchers would find 4 blankets and a flashlight approximately half a mile to the northeast of the site, along the side of the road. It was determined they were forestry property and had been removed from the site. The 31 open metal ration cans and other miscellaneous items were submitted for fingerprint testing, while Wire's body was removed from the forestry camp and sent in for autopsy. The search for the other men was then renewed in the Granite Basin area. The reason why this area was not previously searched appears to come down to a miscommunication of some sort. The Forestry Service claimed that they had told the sheriff's office of the trailers in the area, while the sheriffs denied any knowledge of the trailers existing. The families would later pen an open letter in the papers, stating that the Butte County Sheriff's Office actually refused Forest Rangers' offer to go to the trailer camp in March to check if the boys were there. If true, there is quite a bit of blame to place on the Butte County Sheriffs for negligence during the search. On June 6th, 2 days after finding the body of Ted Wire, a search dog discovered the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling on one of the back roads about 6.8 miles from the Forestry Service fire camp. The deputy first found the badly decomposed body of Madruga on the northeast side of the roadway. He was able to tentatively make an identification based on the clothing and personal items that he had found. Sterling's remains were then found directly across the roadway on the southwest side. Decomposition and animal predation damage was extensive, and various bones were found over a 50-square-yard area. Again, the deputy was able to make a tentative ID using the clothing and personal effects found at the scene. Positive identification of both men was made through use of dental records. The remains of Jack Hewitt would be found the next day by his father, who was participating in the search. He would only find bones, clothing, and personal items like a bracelet with the name Jack on it. Hewitt's remains were found 1.7 miles southeast along the road from the forestry camp. His skull would be found 3 days later by a member of the sheriff's office about 100 yards below the location of the initial discovery. Using the skull, authorities were able to confirm the remains were Hewitt's using dental records. Now, with 4 of the 5 men's remains having been found, searchers focused their efforts on finding Matthias, but no evidence of him was found. The search was officially called off on June 19th, pending any further developments in the case. Let's briefly touch on the autopsy results for all 4 men. Since the remains of Madruga, Sterling, and Hewitt were found in a state of advanced decomposition, it would be difficult to be 100% certain of cause of death. Yet given the available information, all 3 men's death certificates state that they died of hypothermia and exposure. The only exception was Ted Wire. Initially, the pathologist Dr. Liptrap was uncertain about Wire's time of death due to the cold conditions. He was then apparently shocked to discover from detectives that Wire had been clean-shaven when he had went missing, and was later found with a full beard. This forced him to have to completely reevaluate the estimated time of death. He believed that Wire could have been alive over 2 months. In his notes, he estimated that Wire had been dead at least 3 or 4 weeks. Wire had been missing for 100 days by the time he was found. His official cause of death was listed as exposure and pulmonary congestion or edema, which is a buildup of fluid in the lungs. I think it is important to discuss the locations of the bodies of the 4 men in relation to the vehicle, as there is a lot of inaccurate information out there about this topic. The following locations are based on labeled maps created by the searchers who discovered the remains. Madruga and Sterling's bodies were found about 6.8 miles down the road from the fire camp. Hewitt's remains were 1.7 miles southeast of the fire camp trailer and along the roadside. According to most sources you will find, Ted Wire's body was found 19.4 miles from the location where the vehicle was found. Initially, this number can seem rather confusing, but it is, for the most part, accurate, and also based on an assumption. The idea is that, given the locations of the bodies of Madruga, Sterling, and Hewitt, the 5 men must have taken the longest possible route in order to get to the fire camp. During their walk from the Montego, Madruga and Sterling would have fallen first after walking at least 11.5 miles, followed by Hewitt 5 miles later, with Matthias and Wire actually making it to the trailer. If the men followed this route, they would have walked very close to the 19.4 miles often cited. Google calculates the distance somewhere in the vicinity of 18.4 miles, but still a significant undertaking in the deep snow. The stretch of road they were found on has been described as a paved logging road in the remote country. Again, this estimate is based on the assumption that the men found along the road died on the way to the trailer. There does remain a possibility that the routes the men took to or even from the trailer are different. The shortest route they could have possibly taken from the car to the fire camp would have been about 10 miles. There is still ample reason to assume that the men did take the long path, however. A snowcat had been up to the forestry fire camp on February 23rd, the day before the boys went missing. In its wake, it left a path of packed snow that would have been an obvious route of travel amongst the 4 to 6 foot snow drifts in the area. What exact route the snowcat took is uncertain. Additionally, the men were not dressed for the weather they encountered, nor did most of the men do well in the snow and cold. The parents of some of the men confirmed that they hated the snow and would avoid it if possible. The journey from the car to the fire camp, if made on foot, would no doubt have been an arduous one. The snow would have only slowed them down, and if one man lagged behind, it would slow their pace even more. The fact that Bill Sterling and Jack Madruga were found together makes sense, as the two were known to be inseparable, and if one of them stopped at some point to rest, the other would have likely not left him behind. The cold would in turn take them both. The remaining 3 would continue on until Hewitt had to stop. I think it likely that Hewitt died before reaching the trailer. The amount of food that was known to have been consumed at the trailer would not have sustained 3 men for any extended period of time. It seems likely that the 2 who made it to the fire camp were Wire and Matthias, given that Matthias's shoes were found inside the trailer. It has been speculated that Matthias removed his own shoes and instead put on Wire's, which would have been more comfortable if Matthias's feet were swollen from frostbite. Wire at the time would have been completely incapable of doing almost anything given the state of his feet, and somebody would have had to take care of him if he were to survive for months in the trailer. The food that they did discover was insufficient for even 2 men, and the duo likely spent much of their time starving in isolation. Someone would have had to have been in the trailer with Wire up until the end, as evidenced by the fact that Wire's body was covered in the sheets the way it was. It appears that after Wire's death, Matthias left the trailer and headed out on his own in search of rescue. Whether or not Matthias made use of any Forestry Service clothing before he left is unknown, since his body was never found. The only possible clue to his whereabouts being the flashlight and blankets found by the roadside not far from the trailer. This is, for the most part, the end of the timeline for this incident. Part 2 of this video will focus on analysis and theories related to this event, so please check out Part 2, and as always, thanks for watching.